Hi guys, my current project is an examination of Joachim Meyer's 1570 book, Thorough Description of the Art of Fencing. Specifically, I've been looking at how the concepts and techniques he shows across various weapons all actually fit together. So Meyer breaks this work into what he calls books. We might call them long chapters. So book 1 is long sword, book 2 is dusac and rapier, book 3 is dagger and various pole weapons. But what we see is that he actually references different chunks of the book in his various sections. So in longsword, he might mention something and say, I will cover this more in rapier. Or in the rapier section of his book, he might say, I've already described this thoroughly in dusac, I'm not going to go over it again. So to my mind, rather than just read the longsword section and say, that's how I should fight with the longsword, or just read the rapier section and say, this is how I should fight with the rapier, you are intended to read the entire work and take lessons from those different chapters and apply them universally across weapons. What I've been working on is focusing on his descriptions of fencing from a particular position, which he calls the best. It's the Gerarde Vesatzung, which I'm going to call the straight parrying because my German is terrible. And he references this position in all of the different books. He really downplays it in longsword because by 1570, longsword is usually being used in more of a sportive context, fetual fights, often people fighting the first bleeding scalp wound. But he does talk about how you would apply the other positions. So in dusac, Meyer says that the long point, the straight parrying position, this is kind of your central on-guard position, is the best possible position to fight from because you can protect yourself most surely from there. In the rapier section, when he's talking about tactics, he says that when you come before your opponent with a rapier or any other weapon, this is the position that you should adopt. It's the safest position. Even in longsword, where this position is really not emphasized at all, he says that this kind of extended guard position can break all the other devices. And then he kind of skips it and talks about how to counter it a little bit. So clearly, Meyer put a lot of emphasis on the straight parrying position. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at examples from longsword, from dusac, from rapier, what he calls rapier is really more what we would in modern terms call a side sword, and then pike, pole weapon, and we're going to look at examples of techniques from these various weapons from this extended guard position, the straight parrying position, and see how they really break down into 5 basic categories. You essentially see a parry and thrust counter, you see a parry and cut through counter, you see a parry and cut around counter, you see a chasing counter where you step out and then follow in behind. So regardless of the weapon that's being used, the concepts that are being shown are applicable and pretty universal. So we have the straight parrying position itself, which is that central guard. It's not completely locked out, but it is relaxed point on guard. The straight parry action, the parrying action, is really just the turning of the long edge and leading with the point into the opponent's attack. So whether they're cutting at you or thrusting at you, it's very important that we turn the long edge into the attack with good structure, and then we can do whatever counter we need to do. So we have the straight parrying position, and then the parrying action itself, which is about turning the long edge and leading with the point to deflect the opponent's attack, whether it's a cut or a thrust. And then we build counters off of that. In this video, I'm going to be referencing Jeffrey Forgeng's translation of Meyer's 1570 work. I'm going to reference the book and chapter sections from the original, and then I'll also be giving you the pages from Forgeng's translation. If you have a copy or want to pick up a copy, it'll make it a little bit easier to find the sections I'm talking about. I also want to thank my lovely wife Patsy, who agreed to jump in and do this video in quarantine where my normal training partners weren't able to come. So she was very patient with me today, and I appreciate that. This is a straight parry encounter with the dusac, which Meyer introduces in Book 2, Section 33, page 148 in the Forgeng translation. I'm going to do the straight parry versus an overhand cut to my head. I'm going to cut through as the counter and then hit back onto the dusac to retain guard. Meyer introduces the straight parrying in the rapier in Book 2, Section 74R1, which is page 195 in the Forgeng translation. Unlike the dusac, which shows a cutting through counter, Meyer's first counter for straight parry for the rapier is a thrust counter. Meyer's first play from straight parry for the pike is in Book 3, Section 41.V3, page 269 in the Forgeng translation. This is a simultaneous thrust counter, so this is very close to kind of the classical Absetzen in German longsword, where you do a single time counter that also lands a thrust. So as I mentioned in the introduction, Meyer does not spend really any time on the straight parrying position in longsword, but he does have those motions embedded in his other plays. The example I chose to show today is the first play from the key position, which is a secondary guard, but he has you thrusting out to the extended position, and then if the opponent pushes that to the side, you now have your cutting around counter. So if I'm in key and my opponent cuts at me, I'm going to extend out. If they push that to the side, I'm now going to cut around. And that shows how the concepts of these techniques that are shown in all of the other weapons show up in the longsword, and they're all doable with the longsword. So now we're going to do the plays from the Dussac, the Rappier, and the pike section with the longsword to show how, with no modification, those techniques and those concepts work. So if you remember, the Dussac was a cutting through counter. So I'm going to be in my straight parrying. When she cuts at me, I'm going to parry, still cut through, and regain my guard just to be safe. The Rappier parry was a thrust counter. So she's going to cut at me. I'm going to do my straight parry, and now I'm going to cut. And then if the opponent does decide to thrust at me, I can do my simultaneous parry and thrust counter. So all of the techniques that are described in longsword and the various other weapons can be applied to whatever weapon you're learning, and that is why Meyer talks about cross-referencing the various sections and why you need to read the entire work to understand the techniques that can be done with any weapon.